Thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this curious story that falls into that indistinct territory somewhere between the curious and the frightening. Also, we all have to start somewhere, and the support of appreciative souls like you will always take us further as we learn our skills from sentence to sentence. I would really value having your support, by you subscribing and then hitting the notification bell, so you can know when the next part is published. And let me know where you are. Write it in the comments below. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. And if you wish to learn where the two main characters come from and what the story is all about, then why not go back to the very beginning? You're back? Right. Let's get on with it. Chapter 12. The Bridge from a Former Elsewhere. Besides Shadow using the landline to phone his bookies, it was barely used. It was the Wi-Fi connection that I wanted, so I could be ready to receive messages and calls that never came. It's a problem of living deep in the countryside, that to be actively ignored by the social world out there, you still needed Wi-Fi. It's like always having a spare pair of clean underpants running on idle in case of accidents. In the interim, things got better. No, that's wrong. Things just hadn't got any worse. Shadow disappeared again a few days after returning from the railway track madness. I knew he'd be back eventually, and other than a few hours' concern over the loss of a familiar tension, I quickly got over it. Everything about Shadow was so complicated. It turned your intellect inside out if you tried to follow through with your thinking on complicated elsewheres, and elseones. And if his warm relationship with Washi Bark was anything to go by, he'd been here a while. Either that, or he was jumping in and out of the time stream in different places. As Jenny and I initially suspected, Shadow might not always have been on the other side of the galaxy fighting aliens. Instead, he might be enjoying a barbecue with one of our Stone Age cousins, on this very spot, but in a different when. One of the downsides of living alone, unless careful, is that you can spend too much time thinking, which never does you any good in the end. Ghosts and aliens require special deep consideration, thinking that has no familiar reference points. Consequently, it made no sense whatsoever, other than to teach you that your home island was a transit point for all manner of probably belligerent life forms unexpected. It had probably been going on pre-Shadow, and, as with many significant things in my life, I hadn't noticed a damn thing. Shadow enjoyed sitting on the picnic table, which remained unfit for human use, especially after his bottom had so much recent contact with it. However, it eventually entered my mind that he wasn't just sitting there enjoying the sunset, but probably sending out his senses, especially when shadows begin to move and gather. He was back. I was leaning against the door frame drinking a Newt Café au lait, and contemplating whether there was still time to grow more plants from seed. Growing from seed gives you a sense of ownership and a partnership with Mother Nature. Unfortunately, the last disaster, hopefully the last, had seen off many of the smaller plants, and although there would still be a display, I was worried that I wouldn't have enough to grow into the next year. Next year. I let that one ride. And perennial plants tend to be more expensive to buy, and only make financial sense a few years down the line, when you can divide and plant them on. You then carry on dividing until you're bored with Rudbeckia. Those are the type of matters I wanted to spend my waking hours thinking about. There was also the potentially injurious question of money, but I remained stupidly optimistic about that problem. There was a financial cliff edge somewhere ahead, and I knew I was fooling myself that I could live hand to mouth like this for much longer. I was going to have to cash in the last of my small pension schemes, and soon, so I could add it to my finances for the year so far and hopefully pay little if any tax on it. That's the only advantage to being poor. Importantly, I had no intention of my last pension pot being grabbed into a government account after my demise. In the meantime, the money could go into premium bonds between now and needing it. Savings interest rates were non-existent, so it might as well go out there to meet God halfway. I was engaged in that mixed-up thinking we humans are good at, when I spotted Shadow ambling down the track toward the house. About 100 yards away he stopped. I got the impression he'd been strolling along while preoccupied, which was unlikely, and suddenly realized where he was. I raised a hand, but I don't think he saw me, which is strange, because he doesn't usually miss anything his stupid human does. I was about to call out, when I started wondering whether that actually was Shadow over there. The cat was deepest black like Shadow, with a small white crest on his chest, which was familiar. The remainder that I had picked up unconsciously, was that this Shadow seemed to be shorter and slimmer. One of his ears, the left, was flat against his head. This wasn't the Shadow who'd left on his mysterious mission. Neither did it look like either of the evil twins, the other amigos, who destroyed my woodland. The bastards. Maybe this time it was nothing to do with aliens and time travel. It might just be an ordinary cat, although I'll never trust another cat, as opportunistic as they all are. Before Shadow had set up camp on my sofa, the occasional moggy had made an appearance. It felt as if Shadow had set up a feline force field around the cottage and patch of land. I think it was his intention to deter everything human or harmless from coming here. Therefore, if anything did turn up, it would probably have to be a threat of some sort. Perhaps the news had got out that Shadow was away, and this must have been the first genuine innocent visitor in a long while. I assumed it was a male. He did look a bit like Shadow when he moved in the shadow of the hedge. But out in the light, I could see a significant difference. This one had a youthful bounce to his step, while Shadow moved like a murderous hunter with that distinct cold elegance and lethargic affect of a killer. Ever since the trees had been knocked down, the crows used to reel and argue above their former roosts at sunset. These days, it seemed as if they were only compelled by muscle memory to return and fail to find their favorite branch. It seemed as if they had all spotted the cat simultaneously. One of the horrid black birds looked as if it was going to dive-bomb this similitude of Shadowa, a croaking chorus of anger his encouraging backdrop. The evil birds are very intelligent, and it was clear that this one associated the loss of his pleasant abode with a black cat. Poor beggar, I thought, as I watched the largest of the crows make it clear that this cat was going to be both his lunch and his evening meal. The prehistoric beaked and feathered beast took one long glide over the missing woodland a few feet above ground. Hang on, they'd had plenty of opportunities to attack Shadow, yet they hadn't. Just like they knew it was not a good idea to even consider it. Ergo, that was definitely not Shadow over there, only some dim cat who didn't know better than to bimble down into this ground zero for voids and much-loved crow roosts. There was nothing I could do to intervene, as this stupid black cat hunkered down contentedly on the verge, ignorant of the incoming flying disaster with his name on it. The aggrieved crow lifted its head at the last minute, intending to fall heavily on the poor cat and probably kill it. Crows are big heavy birds, which is why you invariably see them flat on winding country roads. They can't lift off quickly enough when a car sweeps around the corner and smacks them. At the very moment everything was about to turn evil, the crow simply bounced in the air a few feet above the cat, just like it had smacked face first into a window. The damn thing wheeled back up into the air, and then crashed in an embarrassing heap of feathers and dust about 6 feet away on the lumpy, uncomfortable track. The cat turned its head and offered the other stunned crows a quick glance that amounted to bemusement. It then leaned forward in a long self-indulgent stretch and looked toward the cottage. This cat might not be Shadow, I thought, but he definitely shared his callous sarcastic gene. I relaxed back into my nice café au lait. This was a new event, even for around here. This sarcastic cat had triggered a reconsideration of thoughts along 3 cats and 3 different timelines, a 3-cat conundrum as it were. But maybe now we had a 3-cat plus 1 conundrum? I'd been worried about the implications of a cat from different timelines occupying the same space. What effect would that have on time and space and temporal stability? Don't ask me to define any of that. But then I decided it was all crap. The last time the 3 shadows had been together, they seemed to be comfortable having a close-up chat on the ugly table. The world hadn't felt the compulsion to implode or blow itself up. Notwithstanding the above, the cat over there might have looked like Shadow in nature. But short legs is short legs. Rather than cause personal upset for the crows, other than its infuriating physical presence, for the next 6 or 7 attempted hits, all it did was lie there gazing over its front paws. It stayed there unflinching as angrier and angrier birds bounced off the fresh air around it. And it wasn't long before the crows became so infuriated, that a few were on the ground having a right go at each other. All the while the cat must have been laughing at them. You can only take so much futile action before you get fed up with banging your head against an invisible wall. Here's a crow joke. What's the best bit about banging your head against an invisible force field? Answer? Stopping. They eventually stopped bickering and fighting. About a dozen crows settled on the ground and moved in warily until they touched the invisible barrier with their beaks. Each took a sharp jump back. They offered each other an intelligent look, and it was apparent that while they might not know the cause of the barrier, they could discern it was there, fathom its dimensions, and acknowledge it as the cause of their headaches. A few of the crows looked across to the cottage, and so I raised a hand in greeting to yet another species more intelligent than my own. They were trying to make a connection between me and the cat. Wasn't that clever of them? These were big bastards, so I hoped they thought there was also a strange force field or something around the house. I sipped at my café au lait as they flew off to cause havoc elsewhere. They would still be looking for new roosts. By then, Other crows vow to have taken up all decent nests in the area. It would be all-out warfare in the Crow Nation until they could dislodge another murder of their species. Then, there would be a murdering of a few murders until they established a fragile peace. I imagined that some would have to downscale and, hopefully, many a ruddy two-loved cuckoo would be ironically booted out of some misguided idiot bird family's home. Dear Lord. The implications and knock-on effects were enormous, if you cared to think about them. Moving on. It wasn't my problem anyway. The cat though. I was interested in him. Or was it her? And I went across to try and communicate with the small creature. As I neared, I could see it was breathing hard, tongue out and panting. Its eyes bulged in his or her pretty or handsome little face, which I knew to be a dangerous sign of overheating and severe exhaustion in cats. No free lunch here either. I had to cool it down somehow, just so it could carry on irritating the crows. I completely forgot about the force field and reached to assist. The back of my hand touched the little animal's side and it immediately started slowing down its heavy breathing. Its stricken eyes withdrew into its skull reassuringly. The cat appeared to sigh and then relaxed enough for me to sit on the ground next to it. No force field for the human then? I tickled it under the chin and it responded by lifting its head. I take it you've got me down as harmless as well. She was female. And a pretty little cat she was, with her cute round face and pale grey eyes that gazed at me in wonder from somewhere very far away. She was much younger than Shadow, and her left ear lay flat against her head. I had guessed Shadow's age to be about 12 years. This little one might be about 3 or 4 and less experienced. Someone as clever as Shadow, and maybe the other amigos, would never have done anything as common as fight crows in the first place. Shadow would simply go back in time to terrorize their ancestors, and let the fear trickle down through the ages. And I'm sure he wouldn't have been subtle in how he left his permanent mark on that race memory. She seemed to be smiling at me. Not patronizing, but distant, as if there were another entity trying to control the cat remotely. She was another cat who refused to speak. You look as if your body arrived before the rest of you. The grey eyes searched mine keenly, continuously flicking attention from one eye to the other. I'm glad you had that force field thing, otherwise those angry buggers would have had you. I once had a conversation with a smackhead who I initially thought was someone suffering a stroke. It was like talking to someone elsewhere through the medium of that plonker before me. I left him to his behavior on the high street, and went home because I neither had the patience nor the time to waste on the idiot. However, I was concerned for this little creature, and hoped that the rest of her would catch up soon. Are you here looking for Shadow? You probably wouldn't know him as Shadow, but he's the cat who lives here. Thinks he owns the place actually. You looking for him? Do you want me to carry you to the house so you can have a drink of water and something to eat? She was still on the planet Zod, and I realized that my machine gun questions were no help at all. I missed the click. She was suddenly all there. And so was that bloody awful feline sneer I've had directed at me too many times. She pushed herself upright and indulged in yet another long stretch before turning and hurrying up the track to place or places unknown. The little cat had a jovial little bounce to her gait as she trotted away. Everybody seemed to be going somewhere in those days. It was all just more wibbly-wobbly shit as far as I was concerned, so I tended to lose interest in it very quickly. Most cats tend to be territorial, and I suppose Shadow was as well, if you include my place. But no. Maybe Shadow wasn't territorial in the earthbound sense, but merely defending a spot somewhere along some continuum. That's different to normal cat behavior if you bring aliens into the picture. He always gave the impression of being a live and let live, or an I'll kill you kind of guy. Guys or girls like him never need to piss on your rhubarb to show you who's boss. I stood up and inspected the ground where the cat, now spitefully baptized as Evil Twin-ish 3, had been lying down out of breath. The physical evidence of a cat having been there was negligible. Plenty of scratches and crow crap evidenced where the crows had been fighting each other, but you'd never have thought that a little cat had been there. I got on my knees and sniffed around the area and could smell that familiar ozone coppery tang. The sister who had visited was obviously a member of Shadow's church, whose body and mind had not arrived at the same time. This was a cat on a well-trodden camino like the traveler I'd given a lift to. Evil Twin-ish 3 was only passing through, after passing down the track and then passing back up. I sniffed the electric ozone again and thought it might be worth following Evil Twin-ish 3 to see if there was another portal nearer than the ones we'd been to. The track was muddy at the best of times, but because it hadn't rained for a while, it was relatively dry. On nice days, the track was a surprisingly sultry space. Most of its central length was bounded by a tall earth wall on either side. And if it wasn't the heavy yellow scent of hissing gorse flowers or the yellow of broom, then it was the red campion. Or the Rosa rugosa, primroses, bluebells and apple blossom further up the track. Plants like honeysuckle, bastard brambles, ferns, herbs, grasses, bees, wasps, hoverflies, damselflies, and dragonflies were abundant. Despite its messiness, the track was an absolute delight between spring and autumn. But I didn't keep with the silliness of plants presenting winter architecture as aesthetically pleasing. In winter, I only saw dead plants, and I despaired. My nose still functioned well in those days, and I could easily follow the scent of the passing of a weird cat. The high hedgerows captured all scents for a while, before physics overcame the pleasant sultry apathy and began to disperse them. Some sheltered stretches of the track were sticky, although not so much you needed to wear Wellingtons. I could see my prints from walkies up and down the previous few days, yet there was no indication that evil twinish 3 had passed that way, even though I knew she had. The electrical tang I could feel in my mouth told me she'd come this way. And then, it just stopped. The electrical fragrance disappeared and the high earth walls bounding the track showed no sign of anyone escaping up and through the grasses. The bitch had done a shadow on me, and disappeared into thin air. It was probably an act of spite, or she'd popped out in the wrong place. I had me a good scout up and down the track for evidence that the cat had passed that way. There was nothing. I knew it was all guesswork, but the electrical smell told me that the cat had only appeared from somewhere or someone else, and then either gone back or buggered off elsewhere, when. Whatever. As one door opened in their mad existence, generally so did another. All the weird creatures wandered through, and flowed from one place to another, using the island as little more than a hopping off point. I bet they didn't even bother to look around as they transitioned from curious place A to mad place B. Just how many species used the island as a transition point, and across how many dimensions was it being done? Thus far we had, here, cat world, dangerous looking cow world, savage soft chicken stroke turkey world and strange void world. Strange void world? Was that space and time tearing itself apart? Or was it a less subtle incursion that the cats had to close up, no matter how messy it was? But of course, I was speculating again, and with very little evidence or data to evaluate, extrapolate or interpolate to any sensible conclusion. But of course, that didn't stop me. Maybe it's the kind of stuff you bring up with a skilled gossip who knows how to take discrete and barely connected facts and weave them into a decent facsimile of the truth. Aliens and other weird stuff aside, it really was a nice place to stand or sit between the high hedges, and see and listen, and smell the physical and emotional headiness of as near perfect a spot of nature's wonders as anywhere else in the world. I gave up searching. There were no new paw prints in the soft earth underfoot. Whatever instabilities Shadow was creating by his presence, he was only adding to those already there. And I remained convinced that if I were to ask him, he could explain it all to me, but for whatever reason he chose not to. There would be so many benefits to sharing his views, or even just giving me an insight or heads up. Yet none had been shared with me, and I guess there were a few good reasons for that. 1. I probably wouldn't understand. 2. I might intellectually reject it. Or 3. He just didn't trust me. The last one was mutual anyway, namely, we just didn't trust each other. I just found a tarot deck in the bottom of my sock drawer. I knew that I had it somewhere, but I hadn't been searching for it at all. I was doing a quick check on how many mismatching pairs of socks I had, so I could recycle them. I must have dropped in the cards ages ago for some unsound magical and mysterious reason. Anyhow, I'd initially bought them in case they came in helpful in impressing women with my sensitivity. It must have been during that impossible period when I felt slightly less numb and useless. I'd given up because I couldn't remember the meanings of 78 different cards, major and minor arcana and reversals and combinations. I sort of remember the reversals being the most difficult because they weren't always the simple opposite of the vertical cards. It had become clear that I couldn't remember enough to create a story, which is what most people wanted. So I set them on the sofa next to me in the 4 suits. Cups, swords, wands and pentacles. Hell. I must have been bored. In Shadow's absence, I drank slightly too much good wine, because I was feeling isolated again. But I'd been isolated for so many years and couldn't understand why I was feeling lonely now. Being pathologically shy doesn't mean you can't stand being with people, it only means that you find it difficult being with them while all the time desperate to be with them. A psychologist might refer to it as an uncomfortable tension between both states. Worse still, you persuade yourself that most people would sooner slap themselves in the face with a rancid herring than be with you. It felt like a more solid and truer belief than any religion. That was the first evening passed badly. The second, I decided to delay, or at least deny the wine, and to stuff as much as possible into the daylight of the extending day. I walked along a beach, and spent money I didn't have on fish cake and chips. The third evening was quite gentle, and so I decided to visit the humpback bridge of the tryst of the odd threesome. All apropos nothing really. There was no sign of them. And despite the recent weirdness, I wouldn't allow it to harm the warm memories of being here with my mother. And curiously, I fancied going down to the dual doorways alone, if only to see if they were still there. A bit of a self-dare if you like. Being scared was an abstract state of mind by then. Brambles and thorns were a legitimate dislike. Best to focus on what I did like. It was a smaller list. But a good one. The reason I was there was because I hated incomplete days. It was like the day after caring duties had finally been discharged, or probably a daily routine demolished after finishing with a girlfriend or boyfriend. Anything that rang your bell for that matter. As long as it didn't neigh. It was intrigue that brought me there really. Especially since it was obvious that Shadow had no clue about this portal before we encountered it. He'd never have known if it hadn't been for me. It also crossed my mind that maybe his latest disappearance from home had something to do with this. My new friend with the dirty new tractor, this time attached to a trailer full of manure, stopped for a chat once again. Typically British, our conversation revolved around the weather, and that it hadn't rained properly for a few weeks. He'd been obliged by workload to fertilize his fields with manure earlier than usual, and it hadn't rained since. Eventually, rain was a given around here, but the manure would be burning the grazing while he waited. The fields would recover quickly enough when it did rain. And in the meantime, he was keeping some of his cattle fed on silage in near barren fields. It was just too early for that, and he might need the silage later on in the season if, by some miracle, we experienced a hot summer again. Farming, he said with a smile, is frequently a matter of shit and miss. While he was there, I asked him what was going on in general. I wanted to know whether what I'd seen down the track was known to locals. He puffed his cheeks and thought a moment. There had been a couple of things. First, the local vicar had run off with one of his congregation. He'd been caught defrocking her in the vestry, and would soon undergo similar before the church court. Secondly, a bit of sheep rustling had come out of nowhere, and then stopped equally quickly. He had no sheep, so it hadn't impacted him financially. However, solidarity in the countryside was important, and he'd been out on night patrol with his colleagues and his sturdy, dependable shotgun. They'd seen nothing they could discharge lead at. Except, as he said, a few more cats around than expected. Until it was established that the cats were rustling sheep, then they'd be safe. My flippant observation that someone had taken the sheep to a speed dating club didn't go down too well. The conversation faded rapidly after that. A sensitive nerve was not something I'd ever expected among the island's farmers. So, 2 new things going on here, 3 if you counted the philandering vicar. Namely, more cats and missing sheep. In an infinite universe, everything was connected, if only by galactic mycelium threads. It made me wonder just how long the portals had been down there in the wild shadows, and by whom and how had they been set up. The how was certain to be beyond my understanding, but I was definitely interested in the who and the why. I'm sure that Shadow was just as interested, which is probably why my unconscious self had initially directed me here. I knew that I wouldn't have been brought here if he hadn't needed my assistance as a useless human. I was still confused about that. All I could think of was that I was having my experience broadened as part of training the stupid human, which I found most patronizing. Training for what though? Standing on the opposite side of the bridge, I looked out onto the rich pastureland. It might be a bit of a steep walk from bottom to top on both sides of the railway, but it was good land. Some places are just blessed with perfect growing conditions. Everything seemed to be in balance in the physical agricultural sense, and in the magic of the land itself. This was indeed a pleasing place to be, even if you were aware of what was going on behind your back. There again, who cared if they were only passing through and barely touching the world? Germs? Or was that a paranoid mind investing unnecessarily in anxiety? A rational worry nonetheless. I'd done exciting, and thought I'd had enough for a while. But there again, the excitement had been incited by another and not my adventuring, and anyway, did I really want to come across a violently drunk Minotaur again? I admitted to myself that that was new and yet exciting. It should have been frightening, but I suppose you get used to these things. When you've been starved of stimuli for so long, you're happy to soak up even the terrifying. I was also amused at how imaginative the universe could be. I thought again about the universe's impossibility of the inevitable. I remembered that it was Carl Sagan who had said that humanoid lifeforms might be rare in the galaxy. Intelligence even. Chance had created humans in the same way it had created dangerous yet vulnerable killer chicken monsters, and cow warriors and drunks. I could imagine sexy green-skinned women aliens in bikinis. I could even imagine them without their bikinis. No sign of them so far. Yet, in an infinite universe and all that. But it wasn't the lack of those beauties that highlighted an absence of something as yet unnamed. A longing, if you will. The view was lovely, the feng shui was probably perfect when you looked out one way. And somehow it wasn't enough. For all the adventures, something basic and human was missing. I think it's the sort of tension you experience when you decide to walk away from a safe mediocrity of your own manufacture. Not too far away, so you can always hurry back when stuff becomes uncomfortable. Monsters are visceral, and you can either fight them or run away. On the other hand, human emotions are far more complex and awkward. What I was feeling was in there somewhere between those two, love and monsters. For a shy person, there's little to separate them when it came to humans. I could always go back home and fade shyly into the familiar mediocrity, or I could go out looking for trouble, a manageable trouble that is. I could do it and not engage. Have it there at safe waving distance. I think it was all much simpler than that. I guess I was worried over my resolve over the Parker Knoll because my endeavors to finish my plan were being deconstructed. It felt as if my unconscious was putting up a fight while my conscious mind kept pointing at my bank statements. Maybe it had a plan for me about which I knew nothing. I needed to test the limits of the unconscious resolve that seemed intent on sneaking up on me. Soon, I'd have nothing, and would be compelled by desperation rather than a conscious decision. I wanted my conscious autonomy on such matters. Maybe it was an unconscious it's better to burn up than fade away kind of thing. Shadow reminded me that humans thrive on adrenaline, and that it's essential to our competitive survival mechanisms. You recognize it when someone's holding something pointy in your face. It's the type of buzz I used to get from rock climbing when I pushed to a new standard. All of a sudden, you found yourself so committed that you could only go upwards, because at that standard you could never reverse on such small holds. Each pull-up added to the falling distance. I remember the addiction to that dangerous buzz. It had been missing until a sarcastic black cat came and threw a big bagful of it at me. It was a lovely bright evening. The sky was the pale blue of spring and not autumn or winter, the pale blue that went well with golden sunshine. I'm not too fond of blue sky with a silvery light because that told me it's the wrong time of year and it'll rain the following day. Thankfully, I could see no rain in this sky, which meant the farmer's pasture would continue burning for a while. This was the time of year when nature and all her varied components really got going. And it was wonderful. I turned around. Except down there in the gully-ravine-galactic bypass where her ambitions were being thwarted by aliens and weird shit. Maybe both were the same and had always been. I had a good look. It might be character forming to go down there alone and see what else came through. Me and physics again. I'd concluded that you'd only go to the trouble of building 2 doors or portals if they were going to be well used. The fact that the last creature I'd seen coming through looked for all the world like any other drunk intrigued me, that particular needs and drives were not unique to humans. In galactic terms, if a creature in that condition came through, it might be their version of a Saturday night in a city bus. You weren't likely to find business of great import going on down there, were you? If you ever want to impress yourself with your courage, then do it without an audience so that only you will know about it. You didn't need to have a cat around to urge or oblige you forward into dangerous waters. That gave your power away to the cat. The cat might like that, however, that didn't mean I had to. Thinking about cats brought me back to sheep. This is Wales, I said to myself. There's no shortage of sheep here. If I remembered rightly, there was no major profit issue with sheep right then. Therefore, why steal sheep? Unless sheep are like cats and cows and have an unsuspected life. Strange though, sheep must be the most killed animal in Wales. Do we have 50 words for sheep? I don't think so. Vaguely stupidly and willing to test a developing theory, I took care descending the steps to the railway track. I knew I could turn back at any point and no one would ever know. So I walked under the bridge and with greatest care started up the track in slow motion like a drunk mime artist, to avoid being savaged by the local flora and fauna. My mind slipped effortlessly from one subject to another as I negotiated my way along, ducking and diving. I began with the intelligence of sheep, the cunning and amorality of cats, insanity of chickens, or turkeys. And, finally, the belligerence of cows and bulls, whether drunk or sober. At least life had moved out from under the millstone of the commonplace that ground your life to mush. So therefore embrace the insane and impossible, go out looking for trouble, and engage with it, if only to see where it left you. Life is never quite as buzzing as when looking over the edge into the unknown. The light was much better than last time. And why not? It was earlier. With a lovely bright evening up top, and the sky high above was blue and full of promise. Up there on the bridge, the temperature had been neutral, which is as good as it gets this late in spring. Yet, with each step I took, the air changed, and it grew colder and more unsettling. Without being conceited, I'd seen this kind of stuff before and survived it. Do the odds in your favor remain the same each time you push your envelope? Or do they diminish according to some vindictive inverse square law? Each step brought a curious diminution in courage and an increase in dread. It wasn't like this last time. Mind you, Shadow had been about then, and he generally calms my nerves a bit. After dragging me into trouble in the first place, that is. Ahead of me in an infinite universe, there should be two impossible doorways, and similarly, in the same infinite universe, probably the odd cat and sheep as well. I was learning that brambles have a mean-spirited collective intelligence. I'd also been theorizing in the back of my skull whether the cow creatures had the same methane problems as our cows. I suppose in space, no one can hear you fart. I kept this up. Flippancy would have to do instead of courage. You never know, circumstances may bring out the brave in me. The smart money was not supporting that, but I was taking a punt on me. It was still safer than cryptocurrencies. The brambles seemed to have aligned in their eternal battle against absolutely anything stupid enough to approach without a flamethrower. Its raison d'etre was to spread as much misery as it could. Here was a plant born of negative karma. Within a couple of steps, it was succeeding. There's always that one thick strand you don't see that causes the most damage. It tied itself around my right ankle and completely imbalanced me. When I tumbled forward, my hands fell onto the thickest, most evil barbed strand that you would never hope to encounter. It was at least 1.5 inches thick with 3/4 inch barbs. The flesh of the heels and thumbs of both hands landed on them with unerring accuracy, most of my body weight passing through them, and I nearly passed out in shock. I groaned out loudly and went cold and started shaking. I really wouldn't be much good against Charlie in any jungle. Gently, I pulled my hands away and, agony accepted, it felt like pulling a knife out of a rubber ball. It had that same kind of rubbery resistance as it came out. It was an opportunity to vomit, but I decided not to. Trust me, the vomit in severe shock imperative was responding to the event. So I sat there on my heels, my hands lodged under my armpits, rocking myself and groaning loudly. And there were tears in my eyes. The fates taking care of the non-existent doors were clear and absolutely stark in their bugger off message. I really should have turned back there and then. However, I pulled out my hands for inspection and was surprised at the lack of blood. The barbs must have acted like stilettos. The deep holes on the blade of both hands below the little finger hurt the most. The thumb flesh stung, and I could cope with that. But looking at the length of the barbs against the thickness of bones and flesh right there, I could imagine that the bastard things nearly made it all the way through and had scraped against bones on their way. Once again, I almost vomited. Still, I was only looking at a few holes in my hand that would be better after a few days of tea tree oil or TCP. No bone protruded, and even in the worst action film, not many heroes were put off from pushing toward their objective by a few holes in their hands. I wasn't. But they would probably have been motivated to further action by a gruesome injury. It hurt, and I had nearly vomited twice. Yet I'd got past it. It's strange how the mind works. It can only hold one thought at a time. Any sense of dread had been replaced by not vomiting. I checked around me, specifically behind my back. And as I rose to stand, I realized that my problem was that I was forever in danger of slipping over without support. It was no epiphany of common sense, a rare event for me anyway, that helped me find a solution. Instead, I saw a 5-foot-long rusted crowbar leaning against the gully's wall right next to me. I was aware that many of the dead easy and bleed-in obvious things in life are those I usually missed or didn't recognize. I grabbed hold of it. The bar was very substantial and good enough to stabilize me, and maybe knock over a drunk minotaur. It was rusted and none the weaker for the red-brown coating. This may all be consequential magic. I had to impale my hands before my perception opened up to seeing the crowbar. As to what it was doing there, I don't know. It looked large enough to jemmy the rails up, and I suppose it's always easier to leave someone else's tools behind. Speculation aside, it was handy and just what I needed. Leaning on it and even tasting the smell of the rust on my hands, I bravely made my way forward after deciding that it was best to approach and confront adversity with tears of agony in my eyes. It was far easier to negotiate the journey with a third leg and to quickly lift my foot as soon as I felt something sharp push its way through the plastic sole of my quality-free boots. The second-by-second details of my journey were so distracting that I was surprised how quickly I'd arrived back at where Shadow and I had hidden last time. There was nothing to be seen. There were no red or dark doors opposite each other. However, I knew they were impossibly there, and just might open up any moment. So my first objective was to be in a location where I could watch the doors open. My second objective was to see what lay behind the red door. Red door means party. In any girl's glossary. I remembered that the dark door, which had revealed a simple metal corridor, opened to its left toward me and the red door away. If I could find a place on my side of the dark doorway, I would be both hidden and could enjoy a clear view through the red door. Who wouldn't be curious about the mysteries of other universes? I could easily have stayed at home with another glass of wine and been warm, listening to the radio and wondering if the cat would turn up looking like he'd been up to no good again, like blowing up a planet somewhere. I'd chosen to be here because I'd given myself a test. I stood there and waited for the doors to open, feeling very vulnerable there in the open, visible to anything that might wish to trot past. I had a good look at the clear ground where I remembered the door opening and was pleased to find an unmistakable mark of the arc of swing. Hunkering down to wait, I left the crowbar propped against the wall within reach. I shouldn't wait more than half an hour because I didn't fancy making my way through that tangled jungle in the dark. I'd sooner stay there until morning. Typically, and as projected, I nodded off for a few minutes, and miraculously I hadn't suffered any terminal impregnation injury. I groaned in exquisite agony as I rose, bent double to unlock my knees. And I was so grateful I managed some structured almost daily exercise involving touching toes. My knees told me I needed to do more. I was distracted from my end-of-the-world agonies by two things. Firstly, the wall behind me was vibrating and humming at a very low frequency that might trouble your tummy, and make you less inclined to riot. Secondly, the crow-proof cat of earlier, it looked like her anyway, flat left ear, was sat a few yards away in the undergrowth. I could have sworn that she was smiling at me, and it wasn't a smug arrogant looking down at the human smile. It was a Thomasina Cruz kind of smile. One that said it's okay to jump off a skyscraper. Just beyond Thomasina, I saw another one, exactly the same, except that this one looked like Tom Cruise was about to shoot you. They both looked like junior shadows, and not the slightly more adult evil twins of the Nothings, the engineers? Which meant nothing. These weren't the bastards or bitches that had reduced my beautiful woodland to a massive pile of logs. In infinite multiverses terms, these cats were barely out of kittenhood. Is this more of the dodgy timeline shit? I whispered to smiling Thomasina. Killer Tom was up on all fours and Thomasina smiled at me, and then turned her head to the red door to draw my attention there. The red door was back, and I could feel a resonant rumbling rising up my legs. It's taking a long time to open a door, I said, and looked at both cats smiling at me now. Making me feel very nervous about something. About everything. They gave me the impression that if you were to ask them right then whether I was stupid or not, they would say that it was too close to call. Both doors burst open quicker than I expected. There was distinct movement as I bounced away from the dark doorway and managed to grab the crowbar to pull myself up to stand. A tall dark ramshackle of a man with a walking staff lurched forcefully out of the red door. Looking elsewhere seemed pointless. Our eyes met. Washibark tilted his head and stared intensely at me. I could see that he vaguely recognized me. I'd been no more than a crumpled mess in a car that he spent a few seconds walking past very early in the morning. He gave up. The dark life-worn face of a man tortured into isolation from the world cracked open into a large handsome smile, and he bent over towards the cats who'd left their shelter and run directly to him. He picked them both up in his large hands, and all three made a great fuss of each other, right there, in the artificial space between two universes, where cats and tramps met well. So Washibark continued to travel. He was no longer the man I'd seen in that single sepia-colored photograph that exists of him. While still dark and angular, his face was younger, healthier, and no longer looked haunted. Where he seemed to be right now was a place of giving and smiling, which would have surprised many people who'd seen him on his travels across the island. In this other timeline, his unexpected interaction with the cats made the tramp's presence even more confusing. I couldn't see Shadow doing that with me. He'd probably subcontract the job to something scary. Seen any sheep on your rounds? I asked him. Why not speak to a ghost? Not a first for me. Their affection was intense and touching. Washibark looked at me again and winked. He had strong teeth that glowed when he smiled. Few people still living would remember Washi's voice, and I'd always expected it to be a rough and ragged hacking. Washi Bark then surprised me by speaking in a soft tenor voice. Silly things are everywhere, he answered, as one of the cats rubbed its mouth across his cheek affectionately in a feline kiss. He smiled. Once sheep find a means of escape, they take it. In there? I pointed to the door through which he'd come. Washi Bark was a tall man, and I could barely see around him to what was beyond. There was a copper-hued mist right up against the entrance, and it stayed there like a vertical curtain that didn't billow out. It was a mist, although not enough of one to obscure the view of a long street fading away into a haze. That amber threshold again. There was a broad undulating road, a street that appeared to come from a distance and narrowed as it arrived at the door. It looked like compacted earth, and I could make out an untidy row of medieval-type buildings down the right. They tumbled onto the street and reached back like Elizabethan evolutions. The upper floors of those closest were overhanging the road. Vaguely humanoid shapes, tall, short, gross and obscene, huddled and sheltering in the doorways. I was glad I couldn't see any minotaurs in a view that stretched away down a long hill to undulate into a blue-purple misty distance. The buildings on the right gave me the impression of lifeforms standing outside pubs of some sort, being raucous, scuffling, drunk and cheerful. On the other side of the road, I saw new square block buildings of indistinct colors, the universal concrete of accursed bureaucracy. I got the impression that these concrete edifices were incomplete pubs, eating places and knocking shops still being built. Curious that. I imagined that the left-hand side of the street would soon be as much of a pleasure zone as the right. They must have good builders. It wouldn't be long before there would be equally drunk and untidy things hanging off each other or leaning against walls on the opposite side of the road. It was only a swift glance around Washi Bark, and I could have misread it. Speed dating night, he stated in a mild matter-of-fact manner. You bet they're in there. I asked him, can I go in? I probably should have explained that my wish had nothing to do with the sheep. Of course you can. One of the alternate Toms had settled down on his shoulder and kept casting an eye back through the red door. As long as you've got a way out. I hesitated. Killer Tom then pushed his head against Washi Bark's ear to draw his attention. You're right. The tramp answered the cat and then turned to me. Choose another day, friend. Unfortunately, this isn't a good time to hang around here. And then, hats hanging onto his shoulders and hand on his cap, Washi Bark took a few long steps and disappeared from my view into the dark doorway. I had to see where he'd gone. Leaning around the door, I saw him trotting and stooped at a fair pace down a steel corridor, 10 feet tall by 10 broad, I'd say. It was as disappointing a view as any person investigating the multiverse would hope never to see, just a long straight corridor disappearing to a distant dot. I shouted down the corridor after him. Have you seen Shadow? He stopped, looked around and raised his right thumb. In confirmation, I supposed. He waved his arm at me as if pushing me away, clearly adamant that it wasn't a good day to be there. One of the cats climbed and stood tall on his right shoulder as they turned to their right and walked through the wall. It had to be an adjoining corridor I couldn't see at this distance. Anyway, Washi Bark and the two friendly cats were gone. What a curious world. It made little sense. And it was easier just to accept the silliness of your new normal. Worse things probably continued to happen at sea. So he'd seen Shadow, and he was in there somewhere. What did Washi Bark mean by as long as you have a way out? I suppose the door from one universe to another would have pretty complicated safety or security measures. Nothing seemed to leak out of either space, or it shouldn't. Perhaps there was a radiation issue at each interface, but Washi Bark had moved through quickly and without any trickery. With no consideration other than satisfying my curiosity, I stepped into the middle of the pathway and gazed at the hustle and bustle inside the red door. It was like gazing at an orange mirage where everything was barely more distinct than a shimmering desert image. And yet, it was most definitely an elsewhere, if not elsewhen. It was apart, and there was what passed for daylight, although it was impossible to tell whether it was blue as on the earth, or when it was happening. I rationalized that many scientists would wet themselves over this impossibility. But mind you, theorizing still left you with the practical challenges of making an engineering reality. How the hell do you create this kind of stuff? Manage an alternate reality that could maintain the integrity of the two impossible places? And then, how would you pass safely from one to the other through a third? I hadn't seen what Washi Bark had done, and I hadn't seen what he'd done to move into the third universe. Every day was a miracle of newer confusion and made no more sense than the last mess, with all of it joined together in some way by black cats. So there I was. I stood in the middle of a highway to bewilderment like a ragged druid leaning on his staff, sort of appropriate with the island being Britain's last bastion of the druids. There was no railway through the path. Oh well, the 4:15 to Pentrath wouldn't be rushing through here anytime soon. Never ever again. What else was I missing? Plenty. After all, none of this was familiar. I looked back over my shoulder. Washi Bark, Tormasina and Killer Tom were gone to somewhere familiar to them, and yet too fantastic for me to even imagine. Ahead of me were a series of lives being lived out by strange creatures beyond the shimmering threshold. And none of it appeared staged. I knew I was watching a perpetual Saturday night being lived somewhere. It confirmed the condition of the cow or minotaur creature I'd seen last time, and it must therefore be the pub universe in there, which might explain why the island had once been the hangover capital for me. Sod it. I wanted to see what was in there, and to interact with seriously weird shit without being guided and controlled for once. There was nothing to hold me back. Other than Jenny, I didn't think anyone else would notice me disappearing. The cottage and land went to Jenny in my will. It was already partly hers anyway, with the caveat that everything had to be chucked into a skip immediately after they worked out I was gone. Heroically, before I lost my nerve, I cast aside the crowbar and took determined steps toward the gateway to another place. My last sensible thought on the matter was, this should be interesting. I just knew someone would go and spoil the moment. And I knew it would have to be the bloody cat. So there I was, standing at the threshold of adventure when the first explosion went off. It was a powerful and contained sodden thump kind of explosion that threw me back onto the floor on my backside, dazed and still staring into an unimaginable place. Bodies of many shapes dove back into buildings, and although I could barely hear their voices, it sounded like a multi-species stampede was being unconsciously organized. The second blast was equally epic. I saw where it was located this time. One of the rectangular unfinished concrete buildings far down the street rose majestically a few feet off the ground. It hung there briefly before bursting at the seams as powerfully as the last one sounded. The force again traversed the threshold, and a few seconds later, I was rolling backwards in a shouting ball to the dark door. My back struck an unseen solid wall and a resistance that wouldn't let me through easily. I pushed myself up and lost my balance to fall to my right and scream as if Satan's proctologist had forgotten to warm his hands. Not only had I impaled myself on falling, but I dragged my hands across the barbs. This time these were no stiletto wounds. This was seriously torn flesh calling for stitches and near fainting in lesser humans like me. To add insult to very serious injuries, I heard another thump as I got to my feet, tears in my eyes and the cold embrace of acute shock inviting me again into its cynical arms. I looked back through the red door and immediately in front of me, I could see chaos on the streets, as a massive building inhaled briefly before expanding and blowing itself apart. A white fireball began a slow-motion race toward me and everyone between me and it. Every lump, humanoid quadruped, or weird thing in sight, was either rushing toward the door or diving into the buildings and making a poor Darwinian choice. The expanding clinically pure white fireball rushed majestically up the high street, collapsing anything it touched. I looked both ways down the track, acknowledging the evil intent and the horrors invested in them, and made a stark choice to end my days here on the railway. I much preferred that, to being shredded by running into all that revenge-seeking, hungry, impatient savagery. The ground beneath arched and lost its solidity. I staggered, dropping to the security of my knees before I was thrown into the patient horror on either side. If it didn't rain, I suspected anyone who might have come visiting that way in the following few weeks would be entertained by red palm marks on the floor. My hands were bleeding badly, and I no longer cared if I died there or not. It crossed my mind to find the crowbar and threaten what was still rushing toward me in some futile, profound and idiotic druidic fashion. I'd go down fighting or screaming, and concentrating on not letting my voice rise above a bass baritone if I could manage it. A person could have suffered a serious loss of desperate courage waiting. That last explosion must have happened a good distance away, because I was still waiting for it to manifest itself in our particular here and now. I squinted through the shimmering curtain. In front of the tumbling wall of white flame, small in comparison but distorted by the light, I saw lifeforms who looked like they were running for their lives. I strained my eyes and could just about make out the familiar six-legged creatures in full flight. It looked like a good old-fashioned stampede was heading straight for me. Bollocks! I shouted as the reality of distance viewing struck home. It's amazing how the distance had suddenly disappeared in a foreshortening of a strange other reality. Staying where I was would no longer be a brave final stance, but an embarrassing set of hoofprints over my crushed body. I took 2 quick steps off the path and into the jungle without injury, stood there, and sent up a prayer. I froze, hoping that the stampede and explosion would bypass me. Unfortunately, I had no choice but to stand barely peripheral to this horror of explosions and stampeding minotaurs cascading and tumbling toward me. I stayed as stable as possible, watching over my right shoulder for what would happen when the stampede fell through the orange threshold in a cacophony of hooves and complaints. Foul language makes sense even without knowing the cultural context. Occasionally, an even odder life form and the odd panicked sheep revealed themselves among the stampede. No one seemed to be able to maintain much dignity among the terror. Bastard cat is the same in any language when you know at which cat they were swearing. It was impressive to think that one small black cat was causing so much havoc in another universe, and had this lot crashing across from one door to another. One minotaur bounced off the edge of the dark door and nearly knocked me sideways into the imaginable horror. It got back on its four legs and gave me a sour look, as if it was somehow my fault. I felt aggrieved, but it had wedged its way back into the unending stampede before I could argue my case back at him. New fragrances introduced themselves to my long-lost palate of such things. The wind and tumultuous noise of their passing were enough to cause panic. Yet my fear of the brambles was greater than this exotic panic-infused mad-rushing crowd. I somehow managed to keep standing there as minotaurs watched me in displeasure, and waited for the queue to get a move on and let them get to safety beyond the dark door. Bastard cat. I heard again. And again. And again. Of course it was him. Who else but Punch? The pale horseman doesn't always need a horse. I knew one who only needed a sofa and an ugly-looking table in a frequently destroyed garden. The endless stampede finally rushed past, including a few life forms that I couldn't even describe adequately in layperson's terms. All the swiftly transitory beings continued giving me dirty looks as if they knew me. As the last giant bovine construct with an orange Mohican hairstyle hurried past, it turned and shouted at me. I wouldn't stay there if I were you, mate. It gave me a ragged grin and then pushed its way through the dark doorway, which slammed shut the moment it was through. I swiveled around and watched the door disappear off the wall. Einstein or Bohr, I wondered, as I stepped onto the path and looked down at various items from another place and time. Someone would have to pick this stuff up in case we humans discovered it, and used it for some unfortunate end. The contemplative hiatus lasted only a few moments because my attention was drawn back to the brightening and now orange-yellowing of my entire world. I turned to see the massive explosion that must have been waiting patiently for me to notice it. I stood there, mouth open like a stricken idiot. Then a voice echoed in my mind, something about moving aside. But I couldn't. Get out of the bloody way, you idiot. I might have heard that voice once before, and was pondering just that, while staring deep into the tumbling heart of the relentless expanding explosion still racing toward me. At its base, I saw what I knew to be the aforementioned bastard cat. He sped out the open red door, and pulled a flat 90-degree right turn that must have been worth a few Gs. Then, regardless of me, he bounded down the track for the bridge, clearly hoping to leave the explosion behind him as a gift for significant others. I performed the mandatory idiot colleague double-take, released myself from paralysis, and was after him like a shot. I felt the ground rumble with a raw and terrible pagan growl that terrified me. Shadow avoided all of nature's gauntlet challenges with sinuous ease. On the other hand, my journey was less elegant, but I somehow still managed to make it halfway to the bridge without a single injury when I heard a massive implosive whoop. I turned mid-step and saw a seemingly solid spectacular rectangular gush of crimson fire explode out of the red door and smash into the doorless wall opposite. The red door slammed shut before the explosion rebounded, and the flames burst vertically to disappear as soon as they arrived. Only the noise of undergrowth in conflagration and the smell of roasted stone remained. I turned and fled blindly, again with minimal injury. Even as I was doing it, I concluded that must be the way to run through any vicious thicket. It was a theory that held up well until the moment before I burst out into the open ground, when every evil bastard barb reached out to embrace me. I don't think a single part of my torso and arms escaped injury. However, the sheer terror of succumbing to the conflagration pursuing me lent strength to my endeavors, and even though torn and bloodied, I left the bastard things behind me and kept running. All the while, I'd seen the cat run as fast as he could, and still keep an eye on me. Nice that someone cared, I suppose. Maybe idiot is a term of affection in some cultures. His breathlessness and strained little face told me he regarded this as a lucky escape. I wouldn't like to do this sort of stuff for a living, I thought, as I fell forward onto my knees and hands and screamed as is fitting when in unbearable pain. The gushing noise of the explosion dissipated to an intense silence, and that vacuum was quickly replaced by my gushing tinnitus. Bloodied and in shock, I turned around, and saw what a feline scorched earth policy looked like. The red door was now closed. Eyes front and stumbling forward mostly by momentum, I nearly fell over when the ground bounced beneath me. Somehow, I remained upright. I looked back along the carbonized way, realizing that the rock where the red door used to be was bulging out to an extreme. It stayed there quivering like a massive stone porridge bubble before slapping back to a concave dent, then settling to regular gully sides. I guessed that the main force of the explosion had been contained inside, destroying everything in there. I was wondering distractedly what it must be like inside the red door when my injuries reintroduced themselves. The return journey to my sanctuary was hell, performed in tearful increments and near projectile vomiting out the driver's window. On the back window shelf, I could see a small black cat, licking some pretty severe-looking injuries. Back home in my bedroom, I stripped off in front of the mirror, having to peel the clothes off ever so gently because of the blood. And there was a lot of it. It had begun to congeal, thus marrying skin and cloth. Much of the bleeding started again, and I was shocked at the degree of damage and loss of blood that a body could suffer and still be standing. Ignoring my concerns over Eva Hughes and his hygiene standards, I bathed as gingerly as possible in his bath. Afterwards, I applied my homemade calendula ointment wherever I could reach. For those parts I couldn't, I did what all single males with no dependents do. I ignored them. My hands were almost a contract too far. I patched them up as best I could, with plasters using nearly numb fingers. Finally, I pulled out a large splinter from Shadow's driver's side front paw. His eyes showed that it was painful. Rather than complain, he just licked it, ignored me, and fell into an immediate and deep sleep. House and garden would have to look after themselves for a while, because I was going to bed, and didn't want to wake up until the pain had gone. Life had taught me long ago that all things, good and bad, go away eventually. Consequently, I invested all my hopes in that, and tried to find a comfortable position to engage in my own cat's cure. In a rational world, none of what I'd seen, and what had happened, would make any sense whatsoever. And yet again I just shrugged it off as another cat-related event and fell asleep.